Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors webinar series on what you need to know about accounting and tax in China. Have you created a budget for your China investment? Have you calculated your registered capital correctly? Have you opened up your corporate bank account? Do you know how the banking system works? Have you started issuing VAT FICE invoices? Have you started negotiating your tax system in China? Do you know about Chinese GAAP accounting standards? Have you created your profit repatriation strategies? These are all questions that companies ask themselves when going into the market. Obviously, when you go inside China and you're focused on the pre-investment stage, you're more focused on the actual operations of the entity. But once the company is actually set up, the next step that you have to think about is opening your bank account. So today we'll be focusing on what it means to open your bank account in China in practical terms. But before we begin today's session, allow me to just go through a few administration points for those of you that are new to this series, to Woodburn, to the series, and to GoToWebinar. With any webinar online, there may be some technical difficulties that arise due to the connectivity, the connection, your own computer system, etc. If you have gotten this far, then you should be up and running. I just want to highlight here that you have the choice of either using your computer system, your tablet, your iPhone, your actual desktop, etc. Or if you feel like you can't hear anything, then you have the option of switching to a landline, so dialing in, which if you click on that button will look like this, where you'll get a dial-in number, an access code, and an audio pin, and then you'll come in through the telephone. Usually that's the most stable way of hearing the webinar. We will have about a 10 to 15 minute Q&A at the end of the presentation today, so please don't be shy. Add questions, add comments into the questions section of the control panel. Yesterday, there were some very specific questions that came in for companies that I didn't highlight in the presentation. Specific questions just pertaining to your experiences or your own company, you can add them in and I will answer them directly to you during this week. So again, please don't be shy. In addition, we are recording this session, so it is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and the copy of the presentation will also be distributed to you. Now, if I could just test the sound system, if you would be so kind as clicking on the hand button in your control panel, that will allow me to know that you're listening in. For those of you that have done it, thank you very, very much. You can also unclick it by clicking the button once again. So let's begin today's session. We're going to be looking at the corporate banking world in China. For those of you that are new to Woodburn, let me just briefly run through who we are. In inbound investment to China and Hong Kong, what we do is we help companies to incorporate their structures in both jurisdictions. We establish those entities, we manage those entities, and we administer those entities. As part of our service, we offer everything from pre-investment advisory, market entry advisory, cross-border investment, all sorts of tax optimization, corporate restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, etc. It's very much tailor-made and specific to the client's needs. All of our clients are international companies that are looking to expand the region. They're all doing a variety of different things, whether that means producing or looking to produce locally in Asia, whether they're looking to sell into the Chinese market, export from the Asian market, and then offer a variety of services locally. This is something that's really picking up, whether it be in high-tech sector, architecture, urban planning, healthcare, etc. The presentation today is, I wanted to make sure that I didn't pinpoint or highlight any bad banks or good banks. So it is very much a general overview of what you need to know about operating the banking system for your company in China, and what difficulties you might run into, how tedious it can actually be, regardless of the bank that you're actually working with. So today is a general point of view, and as I highlighted earlier, if you do have any very specific questions just pertaining to you, please don't hesitate to ask. For those of you that don't know me, and at least you can put a face to the voice, my name is Christina Cola-Colucci. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I've been in the corporate services world since 2003 when I first set foot in Shanghai, and I've been helping international companies with their market entry as well as their expansion within the Chinese territory. I've also helped companies with the sale of their entities and the purchase of new entities within the territory as well. So let's start off with the agenda for today. There are going to be 7 topics that I'm going to be focusing on. Like I said, I'm looking at the practical aspects, what you need to know about corporate banking for your future or existing entity that you have in China. So I think the first step that you have to consider if you are in the pre-investment stage is choosing your banking partner in China. Now, I think on a global spectrum, all banks are pretty much rubbish now. And it's not to their fault. It's the issue that every single bank, wherever you're going to open an account in any jurisdiction in the world, they have to go through an extremely thorough KYC process, which is a know your client process, which is basically a background check on you as an individual, you as a corporate entity, before they allow you or approve you to become a client at their bank. The biggest question you need to ask any bank now is, will they accept you as a client? And the same goes in China. Will they accept you as a client? First, they want to know about your background. They're going to want to know what you're doing in China. They will want to know all the details, and they will want to know who are the beneficiary owners of your structure. This is information that cannot be hidden. It has to be revealed, and it is what is, for me, the biggest block now in terms of opening an account in China. When I first arrived in 2003, the biggest obstacle was actually just incorporating the entity with the various government bureaus. Now, this is pretty much, I don't want to say it's well, compared to 2003, it is a more simplified procedure. It is still tedious in terms of the paperwork, but it is more transparent in terms of what you have to do and what the approval processes are. The bank account is what is the nightmare currently for anybody that is opening an account. And I can tell you, whether you choose an international bank or whether you use a Chinese bank, everyone has to go through the same process. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on how I can help you choose a bank, all right? Because that really is your first step. Now, in order to choose a bank, you need to know what you need from the bank, okay? What is the nature of your business going to be in China? Do you need a loan? Right? Is your business more domestic or is it more international? What type of transactions, monetary transactions, are you going to be handling? Are they going to be domestic transactions, meaning money flow is only within the Chinese territory, or are they going to be international transactions, cross-border transactions, where money flow is going to go in and out of China? These are all the questions you need to raise. Then, obviously, you have operational questions like, who's going to operate the account? Do you need online banking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So the first thing you got to look at is the nature of your business. Now, I've given a couple of guide points to help you, but again, I don't always agree with what I'm suggesting here, because ultimately what you have to do, and I will emphasize this throughout this presentation, you need to go and visit a number of different banks. Meet with the bank officers, the account managers, see whether there's a click and whether you like the functions that they are offering you and whether they can at least simplify the banking procedures as much as possible. You should not listen to any advisor, whether it's a lawyer, an accountant, a tax person. You need to make that decision. Advisors come and go, but your business will stay. So you need to make that decision with which bank you would like to operate with. So just as a tidbit, if you are focused on the Chinese domestic market and you feel that the majority of your transactions are going to be in China only, and they'll just be a couple of transactions going out internationally, in the year, then think about using a local Chinese bank. If you are simply a cost center, meaning you are a representative office structure, or you have a limited liability company, but you're not planning on doing any big revenue volumes in China, you're just literally a cost center, then you can start thinking about using an international bank. But the first question you need to ask the international banks is, will you take me on as a client? Most international banks will not take on representative offices as clients because they just make no money off of them, because they literally are cost centers. If you are a limited liability company and you have a relationship with that bank, they may be forced into taking you as a client. They might not be happy about it, but they may take you on because you have an existing relationship. So definitely think about, again, talking to these international banks. Most Chinese banks will always accept you. International banks, it's a question of, have you an existing relationship, and is your business lucrative enough for them to take you on as a client? The next question you have to ask yourself is, do you need a loan, or do you have investors? Okay. If you have investors, where are those investors? If they are in China, then you might want to work with a Chinese bank in order to help facilitate that transfer. If your investors are all abroad and they're directly remitting the funds into China, then you may want to work with an international bank. If you're trying to get a loan from a bank, then there again, you need to talk to the banks. But the likelihood of you getting a loan is probably more successful from a Chinese bank, which might sound surprising, than from an international bank. So again, make sure you openly communicate and discuss with the bank when you meet with them. The next point is honestly purely out of convenience, because there are a lot of things that have to be physically done at the bank. So when you choose your registered office address, so the address where you're going to have everybody based, and where you're going to operate from, look at a walking distance circumference around your office to see what type of banks and bank branches exist there, and analyze what suits you the best, because you need to have the bank at walking distance, and I'll explain why. You'll see why during the rest of this presentation. Now, if you are, for example, in Shanghai, if you are in Jing'an district and you're literally across from Plaza 66, where there is I believe it is a Bank of China, you probably don't want to open your account at that branch because it is packed with people at all times of the day, and the waiting lines are tremendous, and maybe you don't want your accountant having to wait for 2 hours to be able to hit a counter. So definitely look at a circumference around your office, analyze the different branches, and then decide with which branch you would like to open with and then operate with, because that will also be where your account manager is sitting. The next point, again, it's out of convenience, is if you are hesitant about leaving your in-house accountant doing all the communication with the bank, and it's all going to be in Chinese, and actually you're not 100%, feeling secure and confident, you then may want to choose a bank branch that has an account manager who speaks English. Okay, so that at any point in time, you can pick up the phone or send an email in English and get a response. I think this is actually a very critical point, because there might be some sensitive transactions that occur, whether it be through dividends or just highly confidential projects that are developing within your company that you don't necessarily want every single member of the team to know about, where then you want to talk to the bank, because you need to discuss the terms with the bank for these types of transactions. So definitely think about having someone or opening at a branch where the communication level is fluid and you are able to communicate at any point in time in English. Don't expect the bank account managers to speak German, French, Spanish, and in Portuguese, any other language. That's not going to happen. At a minimum, they should. So what is the tendency for most foreign investors in China? When I first talk to them, their tendency is first to say, I want to go with an international bank. And they say that purely because they feel safe, with an international bank, they have experience with an international bank, and they feel confident with an international bank. My recommendation is actually sometimes to avoid the international banks because they don't necessarily have all the approvals and rights to do business. And some of them are not spread throughout the city, meaning that you might have to take the metro or a taxi to go to them. So definitely think about the capabilities of what an international bank branch can do. Make sure they fit with what you want to do and that they're not too far away from your office, because otherwise I do recommend you to think about the Chinese banks. Now, why do I recommend, or what are the advantages of going with a Chinese bank? Well, the first one is literally the application process, although I've just had the experience where I'm now going to contradict myself. But in general, the Chinese banks have a much more fluid and faster approval process to open up the various bank accounts compared to the international banks that have to go through more stringent opening procedures, not only because of their own internal KYC processes, but also because they're a little bit restricted from the People's Bank of China. The only reason I'm going to contradict what I'm about to say is because if you go to a branch that actually only houses local domestic companies as clients, don't go there either. Okay, if you're going to a Bank of China, Merchants Bank, ICBC, where it's a bank branch where the majority of companies in that area are domestic Chinese companies, they will not know how to deal with a foreign invested company and the account opening procedures and the operations that are related to that. Don't use that branch. Okay, use another branch. Look around in the circumference area. The second point is that there are substantially more bank branches for a specific bank. So it could make it more convenient and faster for any type of remittance or transaction locally. It also gives you the opportunity that if your account manager moves from one bank branch to another, you can follow. The other item is conducting transactions. So if you are working a lot domestically with companies that are registered in China, you will probably find that a lot of them are using local banks. So it just means the remittances between banks is much faster. So for example, you know, if you're finding out that your clients are using Bank of China, they're gonna, or ICBC or Merchants Bank, you're gonna receive the payment much faster. And then obviously, you know, the last one, you know, we can debate it, but I've added it here in any case. Chinese banks generally offer greater bank account security because they are the banks of preference for the People's Bank of China. So in some shape or form, you can consider it that the Chinese banks have more security behind their systems. A tip on choosing a bank, and again, I'm going to highlight this as part of the conclusion. Sit down with the various bank branches yourself. Speak to them. Look at the language levels. Look at and have an understanding of what they can offer you in terms of services. Also look at their fees and compare their fees, and get an understanding of their financial capabilities. You are the one that has to make the decision about what bank you're going to choose. Okay? Nobody else should do it. No advisor, nobody else should do it. You as a company, your CFO, whomever, need to come together and decide with which bank you want to operate with. So meet the banks, compare, and understand with which one you would prefer to work with. The banking structure in China is relatively complicated, and I don't usually go into such details in my presentations, but I think it's going to help to highlight one point that I want to make from this slide. So in China, you've got one central bank, which is the People's Bank of China, which ultimately approves your capital account application, which I will go through. Then there are three policy banks. Which is, for example, China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank, Agricultural Development Bank. Then there are 5 state-owned commercial banks. We call them the Big 5. You have Bank of China, Bank of Communications, Agricultural Bank, China Construction Bank, and Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. but you also have a lot more, which fall under the 12 joint stock commercial banks, city commercial banks, and rural commercial banks. And then obviously you've got all of the foreign banks. So the local banks hierarchy in China is structured, as I mentioned, in these tiers. Sub-branches are managed by the branch at either the city or provincial level. So for example, you might have you have the ICBC headquarter, which has then, let's say 12 branches in Shanghai. Under each of those branches, you will also have sub-branches within the district, okay? And they're all managed then by the branch. So why do I highlight this? I highlight this because if you are, without realizing it, talking to a sub-branch, they might not have the experience because they are so local to be able to cater to foreign invested companies and the bank account opening process, as well as the future operation and maintenance of the accounts. So you need to be aware of, the language capabilities within the bank branch. Do they speak English? But also, are they familiar with the processes of opening up such accounts and then maintaining such accounts? So when you open up your accounts in China, you're generally going to open up 3 accounts. You're going to open up a RMB basic account, which allows for cash deposits, withdrawals, and payments, including salary payments. By PBOC regulations, that's the People's Bank of China, you can only have 1 RMB basic account. So choose your bank wisely. Okay, you do not want to get into a situation where you open up that RMB basic account, for example, at an international bank, and overnight that international bank says, I don't want you to have you as a client anymore. You have now 30 days to close down your RMB basic account with us and open up a new one. This will halt your business. Okay, which is why many people also open up then a general account. The general account is multi-currency. It can have a RMB section, it can have a euro, US dollar, yen, Hong Kong dollar, etc. It allows for payments and cash deposits, although the only thing is that with the general account, you cannot withdraw cash. Withdrawing cash can only occur with the RMB basic account. And there's absolutely no limitation as to how many general accounts you want to have. So you could have a general account at ICBC, you could have a general account at HSBC if they take you on as a client. You can have a general account at Hang Seng Bank, at Citibank, at Bank of China, etc., etc., etc. Just, simplify your life a little bit and make sure you don't have so many accounts floating everywhere. Specialized account is probably something you won't open. It really comes down to what you're planning on doing. Specialized accounts have designated purposes for them, whether it's project funding, capital expenditures, overseas borrowing, intercompany lending, etc. There's a very specific reason as to why you're going to open such a specialized account. You will have, however, a capital contribution account, which according to PBOC regulations also means you only have 1 of those. The capital contribution account is where your registered capital is going to go into. So when you establish your company, you are going to designate a value for your working capital. That amount has to come from the shareholder in the currency designated into this capital contribution account. And that's where you're going to be able to utilize funds as your working capital to start up your operation and to start up your business. So let's look a little bit at the differences between the capital account and the RMB basic and general account. So the capital account transactions are, as mentioned, are those that affect the capital base of the company. So as I said, when a company establishes its entity in China, it has to determine its registered capital. This amount comes from overseas directly from the shareholder and is injected directly into this account. Now, the difficulty with this capital contribution account is the fact that although it says that it's an open account, it's actually more of a closed account and a very, very, very controlled account. Meaning that if you want to utilize the funds, and I say want, but actually you have to utilize those funds. In order to utilize those funds, especially during your startup phase, you need to prove to the bank why you're utilizing those funds. So for example, if you want to pay salaries, you need to bring the employment contracts, show the salary levels, and say, I'm going to pay salaries now on a monthly basis, and I need these funds to be transferred either into the RMB basic or general account in order to pay the salaries. If you want to pay rent, you have to bring your lease agreement to the bank in order to show the rental amount and say you need the funds to be transferred. And the tedious part, I was about to use a bad word, but the tedious part of this whole process is the fact that you have to do this until the capital is depleted, meaning you have actually used up all the funds. So anytime that you want to bring funds into the RMB basic or general account, you need to explain why. So for example, if you're going to go through a transaction, a trade transaction, and you need to say that you're going to pay a supplier, you need funds in order to be able to pay the supplier, you have to bring the contract, the invoice to prove it. Generally speaking, they will require all original contracts to be provided. So company chops, everything has to be an original. So this is one of the difficulties that surrounds the capital contribution account, and there is no way around it. And regardless of what bank you're going to work with, international bank or local bank, this is the procedure. This is what they have to go through. So not easy, definitely very limiting, but obviously once you've utilized and depleted all of the capital, then everything will function within your RMB basic account. The next point is your RMB basic and general account. So the RMB basic and general account are utilized for all transactions, whether it's transactions related to goods, service, fraud, transfers, it all occurs within the RMB basic or general account. You can utilize the RMB basic for just all RMB related transactions, and the general account is then utilized for any income you're receiving in euro, in US dollar, in yen, etc., that then can be converted, if you wish, into RMB. Now, what's also interesting is that if you do start to become profitable in China and you want to repatriate dividends back home, the dividends are repatriated through this current account transaction, through the general account or the RMB basic account. So keep that in mind. Any overseas, this in later slides, any overseas related transactions will require additional documentation to be shown. So, and just to reflect back on the capital contribution account, all those documents that have to be given to the bank in order to release the funds have to be done at the counter at the bank. Okay, so it has to be done face-to-face. Nothing can be sent by email. It has to be done face-to-face, given to the bank officer. They'll look through the documents and they'll tell you yes or no, the funds can be released. So looking at payment options. So generally speaking, there are 3 different types of payment options available to companies in order to do domestic RMB payments. The most common is to utilize online banking. Now, the online banking system in China, every bank has their own platform. This is definitely something that when you do your exploratory visits and comparisons between banks that you should raise. What's your online banking platform look like? Does it have an English version? Do I have capabilities to access it and approve payments, etc.? Nearly all banks in China will offer you this solution, whereby you will have 2 key tokens being provided to you, one for the so-called cashier and one for the authorizer. In China, the beneficiary's name on any online banking transfer must be written in Chinese characters, which means that if you don't write in Chinese characters, you will need to use the service of someone in your office or an outsourced provider to do it for you, and then you authorize the payment. Okay, these 2 key tokens are very popular. You can also have one person put in and authorize, but majority of foreign investors are separating those 2 functions to do 2 different people. Online banking, generally, whether you work with HSBC or ICBC or Bank of China, those are the 3 that I am aware of and familiar with and have used personally. They're relatively straightforward. I think the biggest difficulty for any only English-speaking person is to set up the system. Most of the Chinese platforms still use the old Internet Explorer version in order to be able to upload the software, which is a bit crazy, but that's the way it is. But once everything is set up on your computer and you have access, the systems are actually pretty straightforward. Most banks, the Chinese versions and the English versions synchronize, which is obviously critical, but that is a question you should raise when you're talking to the banks. The next method of payment is branch banking, and I call it branch banking because this means you have to physically go to the bank, wait at the counter, and do face-to-face communication and provide original documentation. So this would be for declaring any entry of capital that comes into the capital account, transferring funds from the capital account into the RMB basic account, and any overseas transfer, whether it's funds going into the account or funds going out of the account, all have to be done through branch banking. It cannot be done through online banking. If you are also trying to issue bank drafts or commercial drafts, these also have to go through the branch banking method. Now you can probably see why I have emphasized so much about choosing a bank branch that is walking distance from your office, because you don't want to have to spend 30 minutes on the metro or 30 minutes in a taxi to get to a bank branch in order to be able to do these functions. Your designated person will probably be on the road at least every other day as your business increases. And the worst part, however, is for a lot of these transactions, you won't get the right document list from the get-go, which means you're going to have to do several visits for one transaction. So it is very important to choose a bank branch that is walking distance. The third one is something that doesn't really apply to small, medium-sized companies or startups because you won't have that many transactions that are running through the company. But I think it's important just to highlight here that as the business increases and you have a very high volume of payments, then usually banks will give you the technical ability to connect to the bank through this direct connectivity to make payments much easier and smoother. But you need to get to a certain size and volume of transactions in order to be able to do that. Now, I find currently that the biggest obstacle is in relation to cross-border payments. As I mentioned, anything related to funds that are going in or funds that are going out. Funds that are coming in would be obviously income. Funds that are going out can be related to any payment that has to be made to an overseas supplier or any dividend repatriation or any form of service agreements you might have developed with your shareholding company or any other sister company. The problem with these cross-border payments, as I highlighted, is that everything has to be done manually at the bank. And the type of supporting documentation that needs to be provided, I'm going to be talking about this on Thursday in relation to developing repatriation strategies and cross-border payments. And I'll be giving a lot of examples in terms of documentation that's needed, but that's just examples. You need to be able to communicate with your bank very clearly in terms of what documents are needed for each transaction. Don't assume that it'll be the same document list for every incoming and outgoing overseas transaction. It's not. For certain transactions, depending on the nature of it or depending on the value of it, they will ask for very different document lists. So make sure you have an open communication, or the person that has the communication with the bank has a clear communication and is not shy about approaching the bank with what's the document list. I've just gone through 2 months ago a transaction where it took me 2 months to clear. The funds were there, but it took me 2 months to clear the payment because we were never providing the right documentation, or quite frankly, the bank officer kept changing their mind about what was the right documentation. So this is a very tedious process. You have to deal with it, but it is good to know when you are choosing a bank what is involved in this process, to ask them up front what is needed. And I think probably the biggest question to ask is, are original passports of the legal rep required at any point? Because if the legal rep is someone who's not based in China, that can make things very, very complicated if you want funds to be released into the account, or if you want funds to get out of the account. So definitely open communication is very, very important. As part of these cross-border payment considerations, we obviously have to look at foreign exchange controls. So this applies to the capital account, which is the registered capital coming into the account, which will probably be in foreign currency. Doesn't have to be though. If you have the capability to remit in RMB, you absolutely can. And it also involves just general cross-border transactions that will also be in foreign currency. But again, don't have to be. You can also do cross-border transactions in RMB. There are two authorities that manage and administer foreign exchange controls. It's the People's Bank of China, and it is the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. What is important to know are when these two entities start getting involved and having to approve transactions. And it really comes down to transaction values. So currently, all banks and financial institutions have to report all domestic and overseas cash transactions of more than 50,000 RMB. They have to report it. It does not mean, however, that you have to go through applications, but they have to report it. My recommendation would be, if you can get invoice values of less than 50,000 RMB, everything will go much smoother. So even splitting one invoice that is, let's say, 65,000 RMB into 2 invoices will make your life a lot easier. As an individual, if you have an individual account in a bank, banks have to report any overseas transfers that are 10,000 US dollar or more. And the government also, the banks also have to report any single transaction that is USD. So that's also an important point. Most SMEs don't have single transactions that are that big, but it's just something I wanted to add here. So you're aware of the thresholds in terms of the values. One thing I just wanted to highlight here, because most of you are not doing overseas direct investments, but even Chinese investors that are making investments abroad, if they do investments that are over 50 million US dollars, they have to be vetted and approved and given the green light in order to be able to make these transactions. So that's really something very important. You know, why is the Chinese government doing this? Well, let's face it, there has been tremendous amount of money laundering, black money washing around. So, you know, with all types of suspicious transactions, and they use these thresholds to identify that, you know, you have to just be aware. So to conclude today's presentation, I wanted to look or conclude with one statement. You need to achieve open communication with your bank. The minute that you have open communication with your bank, you will have much more flexibility and availability to do transactions and simplify procedures over time, okay? So when you go to China, the first step you need to do is meet with the various banks and compare service level and communication level, all right? That's the first thing you need to do. But in order to be able to do that, you need to make a list of what it is important to you based on your China business and the transactions that you're going to be doing within that China business. Now, the bank, obviously, what will they want to know? And this is where I sometimes get a bit surprised, because a lot of companies are deterring themselves from actually being honest with the bank in terms of what they're doing. You know, it's no secret what you're doing. If you're registering a company in China, you have a business scope. Explain your business scope to the bank and the activities you're going to be doing. They're going to want to know a little bit about your business plan. They don't necessarily want to see a physical business plan. Some might, especially the international banks, but the local Chinese banks won't. But they'll just ask you certain questions. What are you doing? What's your registered capital? What type of activities are you going to be performing, etc. They'll want to know what your registered capital amount is. For a lot of international banks, the registered capital that you inject will be a threshold for them as to whether they take you on as a client. This is just a little tip for you, so be aware of that. And again, it's important to ask them the question at the international banks, will you take me on as a client? All right. Be open and explain everything you're doing, planning on doing, you know, looking short-term as well as long-term. You should ask them. So I've prepared a list of questions for you to ask the banks, basically. Ask them, how many accounts are you going to need? They should come back to you with needing at least a capital account and a RMB basic account. I would hope that they would also offer you to set up a general account. You need to know what will be the functions of these accounts, right? They should explain this to you. Although I've explained it to you today, they should be explaining this to you as well. You need to tell them and be proactive in telling them what services you require. Do you need a loan? Do you need bank drafts, commercial drafts? Do you need a checkbook? You know, there's a lot of things that you should be discussing with them in terms of what you need. Do make a checklist for yourself. You should definitely ask them what are the documents needed for opening the account. And when you do your visits, try to mix a little bit international bank with Chinese bank and make a comparison. Definitely ask about opening time frames of opening the bank accounts. You should also ask them what documents are needed for service transactions or trade transactions, what documents are needed to release funds from the capital accounts. And the next point is very critical because this has halted a lot of companies' businesses. Generally speaking, for the first release of funds from the capital account, the original passport of the legal representative will be needed. Which means that if this person is not based in China, they will either have to travel to China immediately, or they will have to courier their passport in order to be able to release the funds. At some banks, for every capital injection release of funds, the original passport is required. You don't want to have to choose a bank branch that requires this passport every time. It's going to be so inconvenient for you, particularly if the legal rep is somebody who travels a lot and is not based in China. We've also seen that for certain overseas payments going from China to abroad, the legal rep passport is also needed. So you should ask the question, is it needed, yes or no? For what circumstances is it needed? And how long would you need it for? Online banking system. You have to ask, is there one? Second question is it in English and Chinese? Are both languages synchronized? Meaning, if the cashier inputs into the Chinese version and you authorize from the English version, is it synchronized? Just out of convenience, you may want to ask whether notifications can be received either by email, SMS, or WeChat in regards to incoming funds, outgoing funds, etc. You will probably find that yes, most banks can offer you a notification, but it needs to be done to a Chinese mobile number. So either you get one or you decide one of your employees gets these notifications. You need to also decide about bank signatories, and this obviously comes down now to the physical operation of the accounts. I would not recommend, or I mean, you can do this if you so wish, but you may not want to have original signatures be part of the bank signatory process, especially if those signatories are not physically based in China, because you will find that original banking documentation is then flying all over the world in order to get, especially for cross-border transactions, funds released or sent out. When you set up your company, you're going to be getting a finance CHOP. The finance CHOP has to be placed on any physical transaction that has to be submitted at the bank. So meaning all cross-border transactions and release of funds, the finance CHOP has to be added. The next question is whether you use an original signature or whether you use the legal representative CHOP, which can be kept in China, to be placed on this banking documentation. This is an operational flow issue. You have to think about efficiency. You have to think about courier costs and what it's going to take to actually physically operate the account. So, I mean, we've looked at the operation of the online banking. Then you have to look at the operation of, the transactions that have to physically occur at the counter. In reference to outbound payments, whether it's service fees or dividends or trade transactions, you have to ask the document list and the payment flow. And part of that process, which I haven't added here, is also asking at what point does tax have to be paid before funds can be released? Because with any outbound transfer, there might be withholding taxes or value-added tax that has to be paid. Generally speaking, these have to be paid prior to any funds being released. So you have to talk about document list, payment flow, tax flow, in order to truly understand the outbound payments. And again, I'm gonna touch on this on Thursday when we talk about repatriation strategies, as well as cross-border payments. So we finished today's presentation early. There actually haven't been any questions that have come in, but if you do have questions, you can insert them now. I'm going to just highlight 3 questions that I kind of predicted, or what a lot of clients ask me about, that are just general questions. So the first one that comes up a lot is, do you get a relationship manager or account manager at a bank? Generally speaking, at the local Chinese banks, you do get a relationship manager. Just be aware it's quite high turnover. So you might get frustrated because you might not get notified that your relationship manager has changed. And you might not get notified that you can actually follow your relationship manager to whichever branch they're going to. So it is important to ask about this at the bank as well. Do you get a relationship manager? Does that relationship manager speak English? Are you able to follow that relationship manager if they move to a new branch? Do most bank officers speak English, or relationship managers speak English? Times are definitely changing. So I would say there are definitely more and more relationship managers that are speaking English. Definitely at the international banks, everyone is speaking English. It's at the Chinese banks where you have to really check. You will find that at the headquarters and the main branches, they have English-speaking relationship managers, excellent speaking, where even their written emails are amazing and very clear and understanding. Sub-branches is where you're going to have difficulties, where you might find that the relationship manager doesn't speak English. Then the final question that I've highlighted is, operationally speaking, what do companies do in regards to giving access to the bank account? So there are a couple of options that you have available to you. If you are utilizing an outsourced provider, so an accounting firm, to help you do your financial accounts, it is for sure that one of the services that they can offer you is banking services, which basically means that they are the cashier, meaning that they input the data for the transfers into the system, and then you, wherever you're sitting in the world, have the key token as authorizer to approve the payments. Generally speaking, most corporate service providers or accounting firms won't ever authorize because there's just too much liability in that. but they will act as the cashier function to input the data. The advantage of this is that they are an outsider. They obviously are also protected through their own insurances for liability reasons. They have the capability of downloading bank statements as often as you like. They are able and have the ability to go online as often as you like to look at bank balances, to see whether transfers have gone in. They can also provide their mobiles to get the SMSs and notifications if something has come in. The downside to this is obviously anybody who works for a corporate service provider, they are working on numerous client lists, and they might not be readily available at that second in time to give you the information. It might take at least 20 minutes, which might not be efficient for you, which is why you might designate someone in-house who acts as that cashier and who gives you that information, whether it be a junior accountant, a receptionist, a personal assistant, whomever else, to gain access and give you that data as soon as you need it. So generally the two options that are available, you know, basically you need to weigh out the pros and cons of both of those situations to understand what fits you the best in terms of the transactions that you're going to be performing. So that's the end of today's presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining. As mentioned, if you do have any specific questions related to you, add them into the questions section, or you can email me at info@woodburnglobal.com or Christina@woodburnglobal.com. If you've never joined our webinars before, we offer a lot of free resources, so you can subscribe to many of our social media platforms, or even my social media platforms. You can connect to me. We send out daily bursts, I guess you could call them. We also have on our YouTube channel all of the previous webinars that have been recorded. We have 2 more webinars, one tomorrow, and tomorrow is going to be about invoicing and the tax system. It's going to be a very tight 1 hour in terms of all the information to be provided, but I'm going to do my best. And then on Thursday, we'll look at outbound payments from China, and also developing your profit repatriation strategies. If you haven't registered for those 2 webinars, you still can do so. You can go to our webpage, go to the events section, and go ahead and register. I want to thank everyone for joining me. I hope the information today was useful to you in terms of operating accounts in China from just a practical perspective. I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Have a wonderful evening, and goodbye.